There was a woman who learned to breathe without making a sound. Her name was Elena, and she was 32 years old, a scout who had spent half her life moving through forests and mountains without being seen. But this was different. This was not moving through wilderness. This was crawling through an enemy camp where 10,000 soldiers slept, where one cough, one stumbled step, one snapped twig could mean death. Not just for her, but for all 599 others who were crawling beside her through the darkness. She lay flat on her stomach, face pressed into cold mud, and counted her heartbeats. Slow them down. Control the fear. Become nothing. Become a shadow. Become silence itself. 20 feet ahead, an enemy sentry sat by a fire, yawning, bored. He had no idea that death was lying in the mud just beyond the firelight. That 600 ghosts were slipping through his camp. That by dawn, everything would change. This is the story of the siege broken by silence. Of how 600 warriors did what an entire army could not. They did not fight their way through enemy lines. They crawled, for 3 nights, through mud and blood and terror. And when they finally struck, they did not shout battle cries. They killed in whispers. And they turned a hopeless siege into a shocking rout. Because sometimes, the deadliest weapon is not a sword. It is patience. Do you know what it feels like to be trapped? To watch your food run out, your water supplies dwindle, your people starve while an enemy army sits outside your walls and waits for you to die? The city had been under siege for 4 months. An empire's army, 15,000 strong, had surrounded it completely. No supplies in, no messengers out, just walls and waiting and slow starvation. Inside the city were 3,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians. They had fought off 2 assaults, held the walls through bombardment, survived disease and desperation. But they could not survive forever. The food was almost gone. The wells were running dry. Children were dying. And the Empire knew it. They did not need to attack anymore. They just needed to wait. Another month, maybe 2, and the city would have no choice but to open the gates and surrender, or everyone inside would die. The city's commander, General Marcellus, stood on the walls and looked at the enemy camps that ringed his city like a noose. And he made a decision that seemed insane. He was not going to wait for starvation. He was not going to surrender. He was going to break the siege. Not with a desperate charge. Not with a final heroic battle. But with silence. General Marcellus called for volunteers. He needed 600 fighters. Not the strongest. Not the bravest. But the quietest. People who could move without being heard. Who could control their fear. Who could spend 3 nights crawling through enemy territory without making a sound. The mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Infiltrate the enemy camps. Kill the sentries. Sabotage the siege engines. And when dawn came on the 4th day, open the main gates from the inside and let the city's remaining forces pour out. The enemy would be surrounded, trapped between the infiltrators and the city's garrison, annihilated before they even understood what was happening. Of course, that assumed the infiltrators could make it through 3 nights of crawling through camps filled with 15,000 enemy soldiers without being discovered. One mistake, and they would all die, and the city would lose 600 of its best fighters for nothing. When Marcellus explained the plan, his officers thought he had lost his mind. But the volunteers came anyway. 600 men and women who understood that staying behind the walls meant dying slowly. At least this way, they could die doing something. Elena was one of the first to volunteer. She had no family left. Her husband and children had died in the first year of the war. She had nothing to lose and nowhere to go if the city fell. So when the general asked for people who could move in silence, she stepped forward. She had been a hunter before the war, had tracked deer through autumn leaves without making a sound. I had learned to read wind and shadow and the behavior of animals. But this was not hunting deer. This was hunting men. And men, unlike deer, had weapons and torches and friends who would come running if you made a mistake. The volunteers trained for a week. They practiced crawling, practiced breathing, practiced killing without sound. Knives, not swords. Garrotes, not spears. Quick, silent deaths that would not alert anyone nearby. They learned hand signals, how to communicate without speaking, how to move as a group without coordination that required words. And they learned to wait, to lie perfectly still for hours if necessary. to let enemy patrols pass within feet of them, to trust that stillness was better than speed. On the first night, the gates opened just wide enough to let 600 shadows slip out. The enemy camps were arranged in a ring around the city, with the largest concentration on the eastern side where the main gates stood. That was where the siege engines were, the catapults and rams that would eventually breach the walls if given enough time. That was the primary target. But to reach them, the infiltrators had to cross half a mile of open ground, then slip through the outer camps where thousands of soldiers slept. Elena moved in a line with 19 others. Each group of 20 had a designated route, a specific target. Her group's job was to reach the eastern siege engines and disable them. They crawled on their bellies, inch by inch. It took an hour to move 100 yards. The ground was cold and wet. Mud soaked through their clothes. They could hear the enemy camps. Laughter, conversations, the clatter of dice games, sentries walking patrol routes, fires crackling, normal sounds of an army at rest. An army that had no idea it was being invaded. The first sentry never knew what happened. Elena's group reached the edge of the camp, where a lone guard stood watching the city walls. He was bored, tired, thinking about anything except the possibility that enemies might be lying in the mud 10 feet behind him. The group's leader, a former soldier named Kale, moved with practiced silence, rose to a crouch, crossed the distance in 3 steps. One hand over the sentry's mouth. The other drove a knife into the base of his skull. The sentry died without a sound. Kale lowered the body gently to the ground and signaled the others forward. They moved into the camp, past sleeping soldiers, past supply wagons, past horses that shifted nervously but did not whinny because the infiltrators had spent days getting the city's horses used to their scent, and horses recognized calm movements. They reached the siege engines, massive wooden structures that had taken weeks to build, and they went to work. They did not destroy the engines outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they sabotaged them, cut ropes halfway through so they would snap under tension, removed bolts from critical joints, poured water into barrels of oil meant to create firebombs, weakened wheels so they would collapse when moved. The goal was not to stop the siege engines permanently, just to make them useless when the battle started. When the infiltrators opened the gates and the city's forces poured out, these engines would be expected to provide cover. Instead, they would fall apart. The enemy would be thrown into confusion. And confusion, in battle, is as deadly as any weapon. Elena worked with her hands shaking. Every sound felt amplified. The scrape of a knife on wood, the creak of a rope being cut, the rustle of cloth. Any of it could wake a sleeping soldier, could alert a passing patrol. She kept expecting a shout, an alarm, the sudden flood of enemies with torches and weapons. But it never came. The camp slept on, and the infiltrators worked in silence. By the time the first night ended, 200 infiltrators had made it into the camps. 400 were still crossing the open ground, moving inch by inch. They had killed 37 sentries, sabotaged 12 siege engines, and not a single alarm had been raised. As dawn approached, the infiltrators buried themselves, found hiding spots in supply wagons, under tarps, in drainage ditches. They lay perfectly still as the camp woke around them. Soldiers walked within feet of their hiding places. Conversations happened overhead. Breakfast fires were lit. Patrols changed shifts. And the infiltrators did not move, did not breathe loudly, did not scratch itches or shift positions. They simply waited for nightfall to come again. Elena spent the day under a supply wagon, lying in cold mud, listening to enemy soldiers complain about the food and the boredom and how much longer this siege was going to take. She heard one soldier say he hoped the city surrendered soon because he was tired of waiting. She wanted to whisper back that he would not have to wait much longer, that in 2 more nights, the waiting would end. But she stayed silent, and the day passed. The second night was harder. More infiltrators crossed into the camps. More sentries died. More siege engines were sabotaged. But the enemy was starting to notice things. Sentries who had not reported in. Ropes on catapults that had mysteriously frayed. Horses that seemed agitated. The camp commanders increased patrols, posted more guards, ordered soldiers to sleep with weapons nearby. The infiltrators adapted, moved slower, took longer routes. waited for hours before making a single move. Elena's group spent 6 hours crawling 200 yards to reach a secondary objective, a supply depot where the enemy stored arrows and spare weapons. They contaminated the supplies, poured salt into water barrels, loosened straps on armor, small acts of sabotage that would accumulate into chaos when battle began. And still, they were not discovered. Not because they were lucky, but because they were disciplined. Because 600 people had learned to become silent itself. On the third night, all 600 infiltrators were inside the enemy camps. They had killed over 100 sentries, sabotaged every siege engine, contaminated supplies, weakened fortifications, and now came the final phase, the attack. They did not wait for dawn. At midnight, while the camps were at their quietest, the infiltrators struck. Not all at once. In waves. Silent and coordinated. Tents were set on fire. Officers were assassinated in their sleep. Alarm bells that should have sounded were found cut from their posts. Horses were released from their pens, stampeding through the camps. The enemy woke to chaos, to flames and screaming and the realization that they were under attack from within. But they did not know how many attackers there were. In the darkness and confusion, 600 infiltrators seemed like 6,000. The enemy soldiers grabbed weapons and swung at shadows, killed each other in the confusion, fled from fires that spread rapidly through the camps. And then, at the moment of maximum chaos, the city's main gates opened. 3,000 soldiers poured out, fresh, rested, armed and armored. They hit the enemy camps like a hammer. The Empire's soldiers, disoriented and panicked, tried to form defensive lines. But their siege engines did not work. Their supplies were contaminated. Their officers were dead. And they were being attacked from two sides. The infiltrators from within. The city's garrison from without. It was not a battle. It was a rout. The Empire's army broke. Units fled in different directions. Some tried to regroup at rally points that no longer existed because the infiltrators had sabotaged them. Others threw down their weapons and ran. By the time the sun rose, the siege was over. Of the 15,000 soldiers who had surrounded the city, fewer than 8,000 escaped. The rest were dead or captured. The city was saved. Elena survived. She emerged from the camps covered in mud and blood, exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt. She had not slept in 3 days, had crawled through hell and killed men in the darkness. And when General Marcellus found her and thanked her, told her she was a hero, she felt nothing, just emptiness. She had done what needed to be done, had saved her city, but the cost was in her nightmares. The faces of the sentries she had killed, young men who had been bored and tired and thinking about home when death came for them. They were enemies, invaders, but they were also people, and she had taken their lives in silence, without giving them a chance to fight back. That weight did not go away just because the siege was broken. Of the 600 infiltrators, 43 did not return. Some had been discovered and killed. Others had been caught in the chaos of the final battle. Their bodies were recovered when possible, honored in a ceremony where the entire city came to pay respects. 600 had gone out. 557 had come back. And they had saved 20,000 civilians from starvation, had turned a hopeless situation into victory. The mathematics were clear. 43 lives for 20,000. But mathematics does not capture what it feels like to lose comrades. To know that your survival was partly luck, that any of the 600 could have been among the 43. News of the broken siege spread quickly. Other cities under siege took hope. The Empire, humiliated by the defeat, withdrew from the region. They could not afford to besiege cities if garrisons could infiltrate and destroy them from within. The tactic was studied, copied, refined. Within a generation, siege warfare had changed. Camps became more secure. Patrols increased. Sentries worked in pairs. But the lesson had been learned. No siege was truly secure. No army was truly safe. Because 600 people had proven that silence could be deadlier than steel. That patience could break armies. Sometimes, the way to win was not to fight harder, but to fight smarter. Elena lived the rest of her life in the city she had saved. She married again. I had children. I tried to build a normal life. But she never spoke about the 3 nights. When people asked, When they wanted to hear the story of the hero who crawled through enemy camps, she would just shake her head and walk away. Because heroism is what people call sacrifice when they are not the ones making it. And she knew the truth, that there were no heroes in that story. Just 600 terrified people who had crawled through mud and killed in darkness because there was no other choice. Just 43 who had died so that others could live. Just a city full of people who would never fully understand what had been done for them. And that was fine. She did not need understanding. She just needed to know it had mattered. The children playing in the streets, the families eating dinner, the merchants opening shops, they were alive because 600 people had been willing to become ghosts for 3 nights. General Marcellus wrote a full account of the operation. It was studied in military academies for centuries. The siege broken by silence became legendary. Tacticians analyzed every decision, every route, every moment of the infiltration. They called it brilliant, a masterclass in special operations. And it was. But it was also something else. It was desperation. It was 600 people who had decided that dying in enemy camps was better than dying behind walls. That taking action, even suicidal action, was better than waiting for the inevitable. The plan had worked, but it could have failed at 100 different points. One alert sentry, one sleepless soldier, one dog that barked at the wrong moment, and all 600 would have died. The siege would have continued. The city would have fallen. The difference between legend and tragedy is often just luck. But they had succeeded. And because they succeeded, they changed history. The empire never fully recovered from the defeat. The psychological impact of knowing that their camps could be infiltrated, that their soldiers could be killed in their sleep, damaged morale across their entire military. Other regions rebelled. Other cities resisted. And the empire, stretched thin and demoralized, began to collapse. Historians would point to many causes: economic strain, political corruption, military overextension. But those who studied closely knew the truth. It began with a siege, with 600 people who crawled through darkness and proved that even the strongest army has vulnerabilities, that even the most hopeless situation can be turned if someone is willing to take the risk. The city erected a memorial, 600 stones arranged in a circle, each one carved with a name. 43 of the stones were black, for those who did not return. The rest were white. And in the center, a single phrase. They moved in silence. They struck at dawn. They saved us all. This is the story of the siege broken by silence, of how 600 warriors did the impossible, not because they were stronger or better equipped, but because they were willing to crawl, to wait, to kill without sound, to become ghosts in shadows and nightmares. And when the moment came, when 3 nights of terror culminated in one perfect dawn, they turned a siege into a rout. They turned despair into hope. They turned certain death into survival. Elena's name is on one of the white stones. And sometimes, when the city holds ceremonies, when they remember the siege and the infiltration, her grandchildren ask her to tell them what it was like. And she tells them the same thing every time. It was silent. So silent you could hear your own heartbeat. So silent that every breath felt like thunder. So silent that 600 people became invisible. And that silence saved a city. That is all they need to know. The rest, the fear and the killing and the weight of it all, that is hers to carry. And she carries it quietly, just like she carried herself through those 3 nights. In silence. Always in silence.